Do you guys remember the time that the Pope reached out to Osamu Tezuka, one of the most famous animators of all time in Japan, and asked him to make an anime based on the Old Testament? Honestly, I'm surprised I had never heard of that before. I happened to stumble upon it on Wikipedia one day, about a month or two ago, and I can't believe nobody had told me that it existed. It's from the 80s, and they probably reached out to Osamu Tezuka because he was famous for making a lot of historical anime based on, real people and events from the past. But somehow nobody remembers that the Vatican commissioned an anime. Man, stuff like that happens, and people still think I'm weird for being a Christian who likes anime. Once I heard about it, I immediately went to go watch it. I found it online, and it's not too long actually. It's 28, 29 episodes long, fairly short, which immediately kind of made me wary of it because the Old Testament's not known to be short, so I really wondered how this was going to turn out. What did they cut or add? But I went in and I watched it. Here I go ignoring my watch list again. So I'm here today to answer the question, was it good? Was it a great TV show? Is it something you should be putting on your watch list to watch? Let's find out. So we start out with Adam and Eve, makes sense, Genesis, right at chapter 1. And right out of the gate, there's a problem. The show just shows Eve's bare chest often in the episodes that she's in, and that's not the last time that happens throughout the season, this show. And I was surprised. I mean, that happens in 80s Japanese animation. That's just how things were back then for them. But I was still surprised that apparently the Pope happened to just forget to mention that Christians don't typically like having nudity in their children's animation. Though I guess this just shows a difference in how Japanese and Americans and Italians deal with different subjects in what they show to children. Still, though, major problem for me. I just feel like, especially it feels tonally dissonant compared to how the show also shies away from showing violence. There are many, many times when they have even minor violent acts happen off screen or just be hinted at instead of actually shown. It's like the opposite of how things are, or at least were anyway, in American or more Western. I know that the Pope asked this and he's not American, but you get the idea. Because in more Western animation or movies, it's much more common for there to be lots and lots of violence, but not a lot of nudity or sexual content shown. Not that, I mean, there's certainly not really anything sexual shown in the show, but all they had to do was, animate a leaf or two, and they could have not had to deal with that. But that's my take. Take it or leave it if you want. But as we go on from there, the Kane and Abel story I actually really enjoyed. They really fleshed that out more. It's very short in the Bible, and it doesn't really get too specific, but I really like what they do with it. They kind of expand upon their relationship and how Cain is hinted at in the Bible to be a very jealous person, but it's never really shown why he's so jealous to begin with. And yeah, I really like the characterization of Cain in this anime and how he acts. He's very quick to be angry, and he's very resentful. He's selfish, and he acts out sometimes. And honestly, it feels like he acts this way because he's the first child for one thing, and people often say that the first child definitely starts to become upset when the second child is born and they're no longer the center of attention. And this especially could be a big deal when you're the first child ever to be raised by parents, and parents who probably didn't know how to raise a child since they've never raised a child before. So I think that's kind of what they're getting to play into Cain here and his character, is that his parents didn't know what they were doing, and he doesn't really like having siblings. and he wishes that he could just do everything on his own. So I thought that was done very well. And Abel here is characterized really well as a very likable character. Makes you really feel sad when he dies. Spoiler alert from the Bible: Abel dies. And just in general, one of the best parts of this anime, and which you could say about a lot of different TV shows that depict biblical events, is it's really good to just see faces and hear voices connected to these stories that you've heard before. It makes them come a little bit more alive for you, and especially for people who might have a harder time reading. Shows like this are very helpful for them to engage in these stories. And then we move on to like Noah's Ark and some of those other stories, and the Tower of Babel was actually pretty good an episode, but I gotta say that a lot of this early Genesis episodes felt very fake to me, in the sense that I could feel that these Japanese creators viewed it as fake mythology, and that's just how they were interacting with it and weren't taking it seriously. And I think some of that comes through. It almost felt to me like they were thinking, oh, if this had actually happened, how might it have gone down? But that's just what happens when you commission non-Christians to make biblical content. They're going to miss out on some stuff. They're not going to be completely reverent. Shouldn't be surprised. That's what the Pope did. That's what the Pope wanted this. I hope he got what he wanted. He never gave there's no 5-star rating from the Pope on this anime so far as I'm aware, but I hope he enjoyed it. Which also means, if he did commission this anime, you'd think he'd have watched it. So there's a new thought that you probably never had before. The Pope watching anime in the 80s. Not the craziest thing a Pope has ever done, but still interesting. It's at this point I want to bring up one of the biggest changes this anime makes to the biblical story, and it's by adding a character who shows up from episode 1 all the way to the final episode. He's there for all 2,000 plus years of history that the Bible goes through. Probably wondering, who is that? Who is this new character who makes it through all this time? Well, it's a fox who can sometimes talk, sometimes can't. Just a fox. I don't even remember his name. I think it's Rocco, actually, which is a very anachronistic name. It doesn't sound very Hebrew to me. But hey, it's a fox. Probably has his own culture. I don't know why they added a fox. I know that Osamu Tezuka likes to have little partially anthropomorphic animals in his anime. And I also know that it's fairly popular for anime to have that, cute little sidekick so that they can sell toys on. For whatever reason, though, there is a recurring fox character in almost every episode of the show. And he is very annoying. The first couple episodes, it's fine. You're like, I wonder why there's a fox here, but you don't really care. You move on with life. But by episode 24, you just really want the fox to go away. It got so bad that for a few episodes, the fox directly contributes to the plot of the Bible, which is just not how that happened. And he's just always doing the same things. He shows up, attempts to steal meat from somebody, and then gets away with it. And everyone's like, oh, that fox. It got away again, that fox. I don't know why they put a fox in this show. The Bible doesn't need a fox, mischievous character to be interesting, but some would say otherwise. Finally, we get into Abraham's story. He gets a good chunk of episodes. I really enjoyed that. It's really cool seeing him go from a child to being like 100 years old, and seeing him change throughout the years in just a short amount of time. I really enjoyed that. Abraham's one of those characters, a lot of biblical, especially Old Testament characters, we envision and just always view as being old, and we kind of forget that they were children at some point. Abraham was 5 at one point. We just always envision him as being extremely old, and forget that he grew up the same that a lot of us do. Here's the weirdest part of this whole anime, though. One of the weirdest parts anyway. They skip over Isaac and Jacob. They go from the end of Abraham's story straight to Joseph. A completely just don't even like mention at all Isaac or Jacob. Which to me is kind of crazy because, first of all, there's no wasted time in the Bible. Each story being told is important. But Isaac's and Jacob's story are very important, especially Jacob, who's renamed Israel, and he's metaphorically, his life is supposed to show us a foreshadow some of how the nation of Israel is going to be. Jacob has 12 sons, just as the nation of Israel has 12 tribes, and there's a whole lot there that you miss out on when you skip that part of the story. Now, for me, it doesn't really matter as much I know about that part of the Bible. I'm not watching this blind. I already know what's going to happen. But if you're the average Japanese person, or just someone who doesn't know about the Bible, and you're watching this anime, and this is how you're learning about the Bible, then missing out on Jacob's story, I think, does a huge disservice to your understanding of what's even going on. So I think that was a major oversight to skip over those two characters and their stories. I know they're not as necessarily action-packed as some of the other stories in the Old Testament, but they're so critical to the plot, I guess you could say, of the Old Testament. And skipping them, I think, was a wrong thing to do. Speaking of Joseph, believe it or not, his story is my favorite in the Old Testament. Partially my favorite in the whole Bible. I love his story. And sadly, his story gets cut really short. And it's edited a lot more than the other stories in the Old Testament in this anime. For some reason, I don't know why. First of all, they cut most of his story. And second of all, they make Joseph's life a lot better than it was in the Bible. As you might know, in the Bible, Joseph is betrayed by his brothers. He gets sent to Egypt, and there he's lied about and betrayed by people. He winds up in jail for years before being betrayed again by another person in jail, before he's finally able to answer and discern the dreams of Pharaoh and, have his life redeemed. But in the anime, it's totally different. He's betrayed by his brothers. He goes to Egypt, and then just everything's perfect from then on. They totally cut out the part where Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him, which is integral for Joseph's character, but also the story of Joseph's life in Egypt. We don't get to see Joseph suffer so much like we do in the Bible, and that makes the end of his story have a lot less weight. When Joseph comes face to face with his brothers after many years, and his brothers don't even recognize him, and they're asking for help, that's a really emotional scene that doesn't hold any weight if Joseph didn't really go through any pain as a result of his brother's actions. So, a little sad that story fell short. The weirdest part was that Potiphar was like Joseph's best bud in this anime, which is not how it was in the Bible. Potiphar is the one who throws Joseph in jail because he thinks Joseph tried to make moves on his wife. We don't really know what Potiphar thinks or what he does after Joseph ends up getting exalted by the Pharaoh. And that was an interesting thought I had while watching the show is, I wonder what Potiphar did think about that, or how he might have been treated, knowing that he had thrown Joseph in jail and now Joseph's a bigwig. But they certainly weren't best buddies. Moving on to the story of Moses, that might have been my favorite part of this anime. Moses gets the bulk of the episodes in this anime directed to him and his story, and there's a lot of parts of his story that really made me think more deeply about Moses in general. My favorite part is when Moses is a kid, and the anime depicts him growing up in the household of the Egyptian pharaoh, as he does in the Bible. And the anime adds something that I think is really interesting. Moses grows up alongside the biological son of the pharaoh, the Egyptian prince. This is really interesting because this prince then, the anime doesn't say it specifically, but potentially grows up to be Pharaoh Ramses. And is seen to be the Pharaoh who is ruling over Egypt when Moses comes to bring the 12 plagues and say, "Let my people go." And I find that to be really interesting, because that would then indicate that Moses had some kind of personal relationship with the Pharaoh that he's bringing the 12 plagues upon. And the Bible doesn't say anything about that, doesn't really give any hints for that, but that could very well be the case. Moses did grow up in the royal family, as did the Pharaoh. So, depending on how old the Pharaoh is, which we don't know for sure, they could have known each other as children, which I think is really interesting and adds a very interesting depth of layer to the story of Moses. Not that it needed more depth, but in terms of, an episodic anime, I thought that was very interesting, and I enjoyed that edition. Mostly because the edition is a rational one. It's not like Potiphar and Joseph being buds. There's actually some rationale behind it. After the story of Moses, it kind of just goes downhill from there, to be honest. It feels like they ran out of budget or something, because Moses' story ends and there's like 6 episodes left in the anime. If you know anything about the Bible, the Old Testament story, there's a lot of things that happen after Moses dies and before the end of the Old Testament. But it really feels like they're trying to speed run through the rest of the books so that they can get to the birth of Jesus, which is the final episode in this anime. In fact, King David himself gets 1.5 episodes. Literally King David, and they give him a little over 1 episode, which is mind-boggling. I mean, with all the time that they wasted filming a fox run around a desert, they could have given David at least 1 or 2 more episodes. And for someone who's so important in the Bible and the story of the Old Testament and the New Testament, for the story of the Jewish people, barely giving him any screen time just felt strange. But I guess I'm glad he showed up at all, which is more than I can say for pretty much anybody after that. King Solomon gets like half an episode, and all he does is mess up and then die. And they kind of do a speed run and mention a few prophets. They don't really show them at all. They do show Jeremiah. They show him a little bit, more so than any other prophet. And here's where the kind of Catholic influence comes in. And because the Pope and the Vatican at large commissioned this anime, there is some deuterocanonical parts of this anime. Very, very few. The only noticeable one is with Jeremiah, which I'm about to bring up. And deuterocanonical, if you don't know, is in reference to the few books of the Bible that Catholics include, but Protestants do not. Two of them being about the Maccabean revolt. And in, I think it's First Maccabees, it's mentioned that Jeremiah takes the Ark of the Covenant and a bunch of scrolls and hides them when the Babylonians come to sack Jerusalem. And that's depicted in the anime, even though if you're a Protestant, you won't actually find that happening in your Bible. But I don't really mind it. It's not that big of a deal. And if you're Catholic, I suppose you might even like that. So more power to you. I did really like one of those scenes near the end of the anime where Jeremiah goes into like this little underground area in Babylon where a bunch of Jews are going to see the scrolls that Jeremiah had hidden, and they're all copying them down so that they can have a bunch of copies to spread around. And it felt kind of hopeful, like they're in captivity in Babylon, but they're not giving up, and they're still cherishing God's word. So I did like that, even though it's not generally depicted in most Bibles. And finally, the final episode depicts Mary and Joseph as they search for a place to give birth to Jesus. And there's a couple scenes with the 3 wise men who go around. They see the star, they visit King Herod, and then they meet up with Jesus. And yeah, I thought first it was going to end on maybe just like Jesus crying and that was it, but they actually had like a whole episode dedicated to some of the events about surrounding the birth of Jesus. So there's a little bit of New Testament in that last episode. And overall, for being fairly short anime, being the length of a typical season, it felt like it had depth, is what I mean. And maybe that's just because it covers such a wide range of history, but it really feels like a journey. It feels like an adventure as you go through all of these different characters and storylines. So, would I recommend it? As a Christian who likes to watch anime and likes to recommend anime to people, would I recommend this particular anime? And really, I don't know if I would. There's already lots of great Christian cartoons in American history or Italian history that are made by Christians. So having one made by non-Christians in a more Japanese cultural context just isn't as valuable compared to how the great cartoons we already have access to that people already aren't watching. Have you ever even seen a cartoon based on the Bible? If you're older, probably have, but if you're my age, maybe you haven't. They show a lot of them at Sunday school for kids, but that's about it. But they're certainly falling out of favor these days. And I think that's something of a shame. And that brings me to maybe I would recommend it. People don't really watch biblical cartoons anymore, and I kind of get why. You've got things like The Chosen and more realistic depictions of these events, and we're done with real actors. That's more appealing to a larger audience of people, and to more certainly than just children. But I think there is value to having a cartoon series that a child can watch, which, as I mentioned before, due to some nudity, some episodes wouldn't qualify from this anime. But if you are going to watch this, and if you do, I do think you'll get something out of it. And if you do choose to watch it, I would recommend watching from episode 5 to episode 21, and then skipping to episode 26, the final one. That's because then you're starting with Abraham and ending with King David, and kind of skipping some of the parts where they speed run through. To be more clear, if you're somebody who is more familiar with the Bible and already seen a biblical cartoon before, you probably don't need to watch this. But if you have nothing to watch right now and you're not super familiar with the Bible and you've never seen it on screen before, then I think this is a fine place to start. And if you do choose to watch this anime, let me know in the comments what you thought about it and how much you hated the fox. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you have any suggestions of what you would like me to watch and talk about next, please let me know. Hopefully I can make another video soon.